Hi, I'm Jim Cates. I'm a psychologist, and this is the second in a series of lectures on human development. And the theories we're going to look at now emphasize biological factors. And I'm going to present three theories. This is the first of the three. And they're all members of a family with a strong biological thread. They're referred to as epigenesis. And that's a stepwise process by which genetic information, as modified by environmental influences, ends up being translated into the substance and behavior of an organism. It's sometimes called nature, innate, or nativist theories. And all recognize the need for social and cognitive stimulation. But there's a strong role for biologically based capacities that will end up guiding the nature and direction of growth. And that's why they're considered biological in nature. The three theories which we'll be considering, which are epigenetic in nature, are evolutionary, which we're discussing here, psychosexual, and cognitive developmental. And they're all linked by this common emphasis on the biological basis of behavior as a guide to development, and a focus on development from an immature to a mature state. All theories of human development look at movement and growth, but not all necessarily look at growth from immature to mature states in the same way that epigenetic theories will. All do suggest universal directions of development, but the focus is on different domains of development. And the same is true here. In these three evolutionary theories, the focus on the domains of development will vary differently, and you'll see that as we discuss them. So when we talk about evolutionary theory, let's take a case vignette for just a moment to look at how evolutionary theory may play out. Let's say Mark and Linda are two strangers who get in an elevator, smile at each other, and that's the extent of the initial interaction. Linda looks away, Mark continues to glance over. And after a few moments, Linda glances back. They end up riding the elevator to the 23rd floor. People get on, people get off. Linda and Mark are still there. As they're still there, they begin to make small talk. And each one finds the other attractive. And as the small talk continues, one asks the other to meet for coffee, and the date is agreed. Now, evolutionary theory will explain this encounter. Evolutionary theory says that eye contact is an initial mode of nonverbal communication. And that this nonverbal communication through eye contact is genetically hardwired into us. Even infants will attune to facial expressions and features as meaningful stimuli. So from a very early age, we're attuned to this kind of verbal cue in terms of facial expressions. The brain is able to assess mood, gender, age, direction of gaze, and even the trustworthiness of another person by scanning their face. And also attractiveness is involved. Men and women have different lenses for attractiveness because they have different reproductive motives, at least according to evolutionary theory. But evolution will explain how diverse and increasingly complex forms of life come to exist. So in human development, it integrates human beings into the vast array of life forms, and it suggests characteristics we consider human. It emphasizes the importance of biological forces in directing growth, in the gradual modification of the species, and in emergence of new species as a result of adaptation to specific environments. So it would say that the glance between Mark and Linda, while it's epigenetic, while it's hardwired into the brain to engage in those types of behaviors, is nevertheless influenced and then matures and grows based on social context, cultural context, environment, and so forth. So it's biologically grounded, but there are a number of different forces that come together to create what happens. Evolutionary theory also addresses changes over many generations and thousands of years, not a single lifetime. So in that respect, it's different from many of the developmental theories we're going to study, because it talks about change in millennia, not change in an individual. So let's talk about historical context for a second. Where does evolutionary theory come from? And most people know it comes from Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in Shrewsbury, England in 1809. But interestingly enough, Darwin was not the originator of evolutionary theory. The originator was his grandfather, who pioneered the whole theory of evolution. But his grandfather's work was based on hypotheses and generalizations. His grandfather had the idea, but he never gathered evidence to support his ideas or to create the model and then support it. He just developed these thoughts that this is what evolution probably looks like. So Darwin was influenced by the ideas that his grandfather had. In 1831, Darwin signs on as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle and sails to South America. And his responsibility is to map the coast of South America and document plant and animal life there, which he does. He's on the HMS Beagle for 5 years, comes back to England, and for 20 years works on completing, cataloging the samples that he's collected and reflecting on his observations. And from there he develops his theory, really his grandfather's theory, of how species change and evolve into new plant and animal forms. Except unlike his grandfather, he has all these cataloged, observed plants and animal life that he can use as evidence for what he's hypothesizing. And in 1859, he published the book Origin of the Species. So some key concepts that come out of, then, evolutionary theory. First is natural selection. And that predicts that behavior will adapt to the environment in which it occurs. So, for any kind of species to be successful and continue to procreate, the behaviors that it exhibits will have to adapt to whatever environment it finds itself in. And species generally produce more offspring than an environment can support. Two of the primary reasons for that are the food supply and natural dangers. Young in any species are more vulnerable, more likely to be snatched up by predators, more likely to die because of accidents or inability to care for themselves. And also the food supply is just not necessarily great. And so they're going to compete for food, and the fittest of the young are the ones who will get the food and live. So for those reasons, species generally produce more offspring than can exist, than can survive. There's also variability among members of the same species in any location. And variability can be due to genetic diversity, or it can be due to mutation. And mutation is a change in the DNA, although, in fairness, the term genetic was not even coined until 1905, so Darwin wasn't dealing with genetics. But DNA and genetics came around long after his term. But natural selection predicts then that some individuals are better suited than others to the immediate environment. and they're more likely to survive and mate and produce offspring. So that comes about both through genetic diversity and through mutation. Lots and lots of mutations that end up being ineffective, and the individual in the species who has the mutation dies off. But some mutations are effective, and for the individuals in the species who are born and have that mutation, if it's productive and adaptive, they live and pass it on to their offspring, and that mutation creates evolution as well. Okay? It's a silly example, but one that should hold true. If we drive cars or vehicles long enough, and squirrels keep darting out in front of vehicles, eventually squirrels who are more adept at avoiding getting squished by cars should be the ones who survive and pass that genetic predisposition on to their offspring. And over thousands of years, if we keep driving cars and squirrels keep running around, we should see a diminished number of squirrels who end up getting run over by cars. So that would be the genetic idea, the evolutionary idea that genetics would save squirrels. So forms of life that fail to adapt then become extinct. And they were previously called survival of the fittest. But we now call them fitness rather than survival of the fittest. And fitness has also been expanded to include inclusive fitness. So fitness is not only determined by reproductive success, but it's determined by promoting the survival and reproductive success of others who share one's genetic ancestry. So for example, we once considered Neanderthals to have become an extinct line of humans. We thought that their species simply could not adapt, and it ended up becoming extinct. What we've learned is that their DNA was absorbed into Homo sapiens. So rather than becoming extinct, there was a survival and reproductive success by involving their genetic ancestry in Homo sapiens' genetic ancestry. This is a process of inclusive fitness. A new species emerges which is comprised of Neanderthal and the early version of Homo sapiens. So there's an adaptation that underlies evolutionary change, always. And the process by which living things develop structures and problem-solving mechanisms that enable them to thrive in a particular environment. For example, the need to distinguish edible from poisonous foods. That adaptation may occur in sensory capacities such as taste or smell or visual discrimination, or all three. That adaptation can be biological or it can be behavioral. But let's look at for just a second at the evolution of the human species. How does this come about? One of the puzzles that remains is human evolution. We're still trying to put that puzzle together. It appears that a common modern ancestor had offspring who migrated throughout the world and ended up dominating other human species. In this process of inclusive fitness, Neanderthals are an example. It's not the fact that it happened that's so surprising. It's the rapidity with which the human species developed adaptive capacities. And one model for this is called autocatalysis. So that a capacity that emerges in the change process of adaptation results in an acceleration of the change process itself. That's autocatalysis. What does that mean? Well, one possible example of this, and again, this is all theoretical, but one possible example of this is the move to bipedal locomotion. our ancestors moved from walking on four limbs to walking on 2 limbs. That frees up the 4 limbs for motion and to be able to use the 4 limbs, then the 4 paws, for a grasping motion and to begin to use tools. That's the advent of hands. With the manufacture of tools and artifacts, work becomes easier, but intelligence is increased as a part of the tool-using habit. So the mental capacity and the tendency to use artifacts becomes mutually reinforcing. The more tools I use, the smarter I become. The smarter I become, the more tools I use. And that ends up rapidly increasing adaptation, much more quickly than would otherwise be the case without that link back and forth, that reinforcement back and forth. So, for example, cooperation during hunting is perfected. Other animals, other species clearly cooperate during hunting. A pride of lions will cooperate during hunting, but they haven't perfected it to the extent that human beings seem to be able to perfect it once they were using tools. So what are some new directions then that evolutionary theory seems to be going? Well, one is ethology. For example, we can observe dogs at a dog park, and if you see them, they'll nip and bite at each other, but they don't do real harm. And ethologists have wondered for a long time about the evolutionary benefit of play. And that's what dogs are doing. It's really nipping and biting each other, playing back and forth. But more generally, there's a question of the adaptive function of emotions. And ethology examines how a particular behavior contributes not just to the future growth or development of the individual, but to the adaptation and continuation of the species. So Darwin's interest, basic evolutionary interest, is the evolution of the species. An ethologist's interest is behaviors central to the species' survival. It's evolutionary significant behaviors that appear innate and specific to a particular species. What are the behaviors that this species exhibits, that other species don't exhibit, that allow it to survive? And they're commonly associated with eating, mating, and protecting a species from harm. There were 2 early contributors to this field of ethology. One was Konrad Lorenz, the other was Nico Tinbergen. And both focused on innate behaviors and how they're expressed under natural conditions. And some are reflexes, simple response to a simple stimuli. If you've ever noticed a baby will grasp a finger. If you put the finger in their palm, they have a reflex reaction to grasp it, or another object placed in the palm. But many of these infant reflexes disappear by the end of the first year. So we know that not all reflexes last forever. They appear to have a fixed time or fixed purpose. Ethologists look at fixed or modal action patterns. And these are genetically guided sequences that are prompted by a particular stimulus pattern that releases or signals the behavior. For example, I just mentioned the reflex of a child grasping, and that may have to do with holding on to the mother, that type of thing. We know squirrels bury nuts. We know goslings or ducklings will imprint on their mother. Yawning, if I yawned right there, if you find yourself wanting to yawn as well, that's a human fixed or modal action pattern. We tend to yawn once the behavior is modeled. Now I'm finding myself wanting to yawn because I pretend yawned. John Bowlby brought ethology to infant caregiver attachment. And he described the attachment behavior system. And he was talking about a complex set of reflexes and signaling behaviors that end up bringing about caregiving responses from adults. So, in turn, adult responses shape infant behaviors. So there's a back and forth, very much like the tool analogy where, we end up using tools, makes us more intelligent. Infants and adults go back and forth and have a mutually reinforcing interaction where the adult reinforces the infant's behavior, the infant reinforces the adult's behavior, and cues get given back and forth on how to react to each other and what those reactions mean, and a very complex social system develops out of that. And those patterns of attachment will then also influence adolescent and adult behaviors. So they move forward across time, they create influences across time. Now what about ethology and fitness? Remember we talked about survival of the fittest became fitness, and we also talk about inclusive fitness. What about ethology and fitness? Well, William Charlesworth studied the importance of social interaction as a mechanism that allows humans to obtain resources from the environment at any point in the lifespan. And strategies for obtaining resources tend to change with development, not surprisingly. So we find that fitness will change with developmental levels. That brings us toward another area of study in evolutionary work, evolutionary psychology. Ethology will focus on analyzing adaptive behavior patterns across species. Evolutionary psychology draws on principles of evolution to understand the human mind. So for evolutionary psychology, the mind functions as a physical system, and it's designed to generate responses that are effective in dealing with information received from specific environmental situations. And the mind is then comprised of subsystems, and they evolve in response to specific problems humans have faced over thousands of years as we have evolved from our hominid ancestors. So the mind and the way the mind works, a series of subsystems integrating with each other, having developed over thousands of years. Again, a much more complex example of my squish squirrels analogy. And through the process of natural selection, certain mechanisms develop that are sensitive to specific environmental conditions. And when they're activated, they produce an adaptive response or set of responses. And evolutionary psychologists then will look at how the mind addresses adaptive problems. And these are generally universal. They're across cultures, they're across societies, they're across environments. And adaptive problems then have two essential qualities. They occurred repeatedly in human evolutionary history, and solutions to these problems influenced reproductive success. So for example, and this is controversial, I'll grant you, but the idea is that the gender that has a greater investment in the offspring will be more selective in choosing a mate, while the gender that has less investment in the offspring will be more competitive with others of the same sex for sexual access. So what that says is that we anticipate finding across cultures, universally, across environments, across societies, across time, that women are more selective in choosing a mate because they have more investment in caring for the offspring. Men will be less selective in choosing a mate and more anxious to have sexual access to a greater variety of women because they want to expand the number of offspring that they can have available to reproduce, and that would be epigenetic. So moving past that, creating something different, is going to be social, is going to be cultural. Okay. What about questions about human development and evolutionary theory? Is there direction of change over the lifespan? Well, natural selection focuses on change over thousands of years. So it doesn't really look at a single lifespan and say, yes, there's change, no, there's not. It does, however, say that the human genome includes a plan for the nature and direction of growth. But according to evolutionary theory, that human genome is a product of natural selection. And the idea is that the human mind will approach specific adaptive problems with an eye toward how the solution contributes to reproductive success or the success of the larger group of which they're a member. How relevant do early experiences become for later development? Well, fitness includes the ability to survive that vulnerable period of intimacy. And how do environmental and social contexts affect individual development? Well, a basic mechanism of change is natural selection, which predicts that behavior is adapted to the environment in which it's occurring. So what factors are going to place individuals at risk during specific periods during the lifespan? Well, we know that fitness is going to be enhanced when the individual is able to meet goals for health and safety, when the individual is able to meet goals for reproductive success, social allegiances, and the care and nurture of the offspring. So are there practical applications to this? Remember, we've said in the previous lecture, it's great to have a theory that explains a lot of things, but in terms of human development, is it useful for intervention, for education, for treatment? And this theory assumes that modern humans carry a mind that has evolved in response to specific survival challenges, and that a wide range of behaviors have been identified that have genetic origins. But how much applicability it really has to the individual and saying something about the individual's development becomes questionable. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of evolutionary theory? Well, some of the strengths are that it stimulates investigation into the universal nature of human thought and behavior. It draws attention to the interconnections between the individual life history and the long-range history of the species. We do need to be aware of that even though each of us lives an individual life, it's in the context of the history of the species. And it offers explanations of widely shared human behaviors. Sometimes those explanations would not be available were we not able to look in a much broader context. Some of the weaknesses, it assumes that the species today is the product of natural selection based on previous millennia. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It continues to reconstruct prehistoric life, and therefore the understanding of social and biophysiological environments continue to change because we continually find new information and redevelop our history and understanding of prehistoric life. It's very difficult to stay rooted in what prehistoric life really was. Evolutionary theory assumes the mind is comprised of small, discrete mechanisms that are specialized in their work. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. There's some evidence to support it. There's some evidence that it's much more complex than that simplistic idea. And evolutionary theory is explanatory, but it's not predictive. It explains a lot, but it can't predict behavior. And that, again, is a limitation. So that is an overview of how evolutionary theory works. Again, as far as human development goes, very much a macro theory. It doesn't come down to the individual, but it does give a very broad view of how human development occurs.